born in the land of riches, gold, oil, diamond bright. But our streets are stained with blood, but the youth fight for their rights. Protesting for a future, yet they're slaughtered in the night. While the leaders sit in silence, flying private jets in flight. They drive their bulletproof cars while we walk these streets. Say there's no money, but their jets fly with ease. Our children starve, but they're too blind to see. Muguland, why can't we be free? Muguland, Muguland. We're crying out for change, but they shoot us on the streets. Muguland, Muguland. We have all it takes to be great, but only corruption is great in the land. They say no money's left, but the rich keep getting fat. Their wrists shine with diamonds, private jets, imagine that.
The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the bustling streets of Eleniyan city. As darkness crept across the metropolis, the familiar symphony of honking horns and street vendors' calls was shattered by the sharp, menacing sound of gunfire. The echoes reverberated through the narrow alleys and wide boulevards, a chilling sign that something terrible had happened. Meanwhile, in the affluent neighborhood of Kokuyi, far from the chaos of the streets, a group of powerful men gathered around a massive mahogany table in a luxurious mansion. These were the Kingmakers of Muguland, the shadowy figures who pulled the strings of the nation's political machinery. Tonight, they had convened to decide the fate of one of their own. At the head of the table sat Chief Bisola Eleniyan, a man whose ascent to power had been as swift as it was mysterious. His thick-framed glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, obscuring eyes that many believed could see straight into a man's soul. The tension in the room was palpable, each man's face a mask of steely resolve, but their eyes betrayed the fear that lurked just beneath the surface. The only sound was the occasional click of a lighter as someone lit a cigarette, adding to the haze of smoke that hung in the air. Suddenly, the double doors at the far end of the room burst open, and a man staggered in, clutching his side. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining the rumpled white of his shirt. The men at the table leapt to their feet, their chairs scraping loudly against the polished marble floor.
"Bogunlo is dead," the man gasped before collapsing to the ground.
A collective gasp filled the room as people absorbed the shocking news that Williams Bogunlo, the charismatic politician who had once posed a serious threat to Chief Bisola Eleniyan's carefully constructed empire, was dead. The implications were as clear as the blood now pooling around the fallen man. Chief Bisola Eleniyan remained seated, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his gaze sweeping across the shocked faces of the men who had, until moments ago, considered themselves untouchable.
It begins, the price of power.
As the men exchanged glances, one of the bolder members of the group finally spoke up.
Chief, did you order this?
Eleniyan's eyes narrowed.
You think I would do something so reckless? This wasn't my doing. I need to know who did this. Find out now.
Chief Eleniyan's expression turned somber as he sat back down, contemplating the implications. He knew people would blame him. They always did. After all, Bogunlo was his biggest rival. But Eleniyan genuinely had nothing to do with this. Yet he also knew that bearing the weight of such accusations was part of the price of power, and he was prepared to pay it. Eleniyan's expression remained inscrutable, but a flicker of something, sadness perhaps, passed through his eyes. He knew that no matter what he said, no matter how he protested his innocence, the blame would fall on him. Bogunlo was his biggest rival, and in the eyes of the people, that made him the prime suspect. As his people kept looking at each other in shock and confusion at the unexpected development, Chief Eleniyan sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. He knew that in the world of Mugulandian politics, truth was often irrelevant. Perception was everything, and the perception now was that he was a killer. It was an accusation he would have to weather, a storm he would have to endure. He had chosen this path, and he was prepared to face its consequences. Outside, Eleniyan city roared in response to the news. Protests erupted spontaneously as rumors of Bogunlo's assassination spread like wildfire. The streets were flooded with people demanding justice, their cries echoing off the walls of the city that had given birth to so many broken dreams.
Justice for Bogunlo. We demand justice.
But above the chaos, like a shadow looming over the land, was the figure of Chief Bisola Eleniyan, a man who had mastered the art of political survival and who knew that tonight was just the opening move in a much larger, bloodier game. As night fell, Chief Bisola Eleniyan returned to his seat, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm on the table. He had climbed too high, seen too much, to be afraid now.
My enemies will come for me, as they always have, but this time, I am ready. I will not just survive, I will dominate.
Outside, the gunfire continued, a stark reminder that in the world of Mugulandian politics, power was not simply earned, it was seized, manipulated, and often paid for in blood. And tonight, Chief Bisola Eleniyan was prepared to pay that price.
The rain pounded relentlessly against the tin roof of the small room in Mushin, a rhythmic drumming that seemed to mirror the chaotic thoughts racing through Dauda Omolomo's mind. He sat hunched over a weathered wooden table, staring intently at the worn passport in front of him. The photograph inside belonged to a young woman, her face framed by tight curls and her eyes wide with the innocence of youth. The name beside the picture read Bisola Eleniyan. Dauda's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like a war drum. This was it, the moment that would change everything. The room felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in as the weight of his decision pressed down on him. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and desperation, mingling with the sharp tang of sweat that clung to his skin. He picked up the passport, his fingers trembling slightly. It was not fear that made him shake, but the gravity of what he was about to do. The path he was about to take was one from which there would be no return. But Dauda had long since resigned himself to the fact that the life he was born into could not be the life he lived. Not if he wanted to survive. Not if he wanted to thrive. His gaze drifted to the corner of the room, where a small shrine had been hastily erected. At its center was a photograph of the real Bisola Eleniyan, the daughter of his political mentor, Chief Bisola Eleniyan. She had been the apple of her father's eye, a bright and promising student with a future as luminous as the morning sun. But fate had other plans. A sudden and mysterious illness had struck her down in the prime of her life, leaving Chief Eleniyan devastated. It was in the aftermath of her death that Dauda had first conceived his audacious plan. He had been close to the chief, who had seen potential in the young man and taken him under his wing, but with Bisola gone, Dauda knew that his position was precarious. He needed a way out, a way to ensure his survival and to seize the opportunities that Alaye City could no longer offer him. She was too good for this world, Chief Eleniyan had once said, his voice thick with grief as he stared into the distance. She was going to change the world, Dauda, but now the world is a little darker without her. Dauda had nodded silently, offering what little comfort he could. But even as he did, his mind was working furiously, plotting a way to use the situation to his advantage. He saw an opportunity where others saw only tragedy. One night, as the chief lay drunk and weeping over the loss of his daughter, Dauda had quietly slipped into Bisola's room. There, among the remnants of her life, he found her passport. The resemblance was faint but unmistakable, enough to pass for siblings, perhaps even close family. With the right story, Dauda could make it work. And in that moment, Dauda Omolomo, an unremarkable man born in Umoja City in faraway Nuso State to unremarkable parents, died. And the legend of the man later to be known globally as Chief Bisola Eleniyan was born. He was no longer the son of a struggling market woman, doomed to a life of mediocrity. He was now the child of a respected political figure, a man with connections and influence, a man who could open doors that had always been slammed shut in Dauda's face. His decision made, Dauda Omolomo, now determined to legitimize himself as the reincarnated Bisola Eleniyan, had approached the chief with a plan. "Chief, I need your help," Dauda said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his mind. "I want to honor Bisola's memory by continuing her education in the United States. I have been accepted into a program there, but I need your support to make it happen." Chief Eleniyan had looked at him with bleary eyes, clouded by both alcohol and grief. "You want to go in her place?" he had asked, his voice tinged with confusion. "Yes, Chief," Dauda had replied. I want to carry on her legacy, to fulfill the dreams she could not. I want to make you proud, just as she would have. The chief had stared at him for a long moment, and for a terrifying second, Bisola thought his plan had failed. But then the old man had nodded, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. She would have wanted that, Chief Eleniyan had whispered. She would have wanted you to succeed where she could not. And with that, Dauda had secured his passage out of Iyanla City and into a new life as a man reborn, or more appropriately as a woman reborn, with the Bisola Eleniyan identity and the full permission of the man who had given his now deceased daughter that name. The documents were prepared, the funds transferred, and before long the new Bisola Eleniyan was boarding a plane bound for the United States. The city that had given him life had now given him a new identity, a new purpose, and a new path to power. As the plane took off, leaving Iyanla City behind, Bisola leaned back in his seat, a small smile playing on his lips. The game had begun, and he was more than ready to play. "I will surely come back someday," he whispered to himself, the roar of the engines drowning out his words, "but not until I have everything to be somebody in this land." The clouds parted below, revealing the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Beyond it lay the future he had stolen, the future he would make his own. In that moment, Bisola Eleniyan was no longer just a man. He was an idea, a force that would stop at nothing to claim what he believed was rightfully his. And nothing, not even the memory of the real Bisola Eleniyan, would stand in his way.
The wind whipped through the streets, biting and cold, as Bisola Eleniyan, formerly known as Dauda Omolomo, navigated the vast, unfamiliar cityscape. The towering buildings, bustling crowds, and electric energy of the city both thrilled and overwhelmed him. He had left Iyanla City with a singular mission: to succeed at all costs. But the path he found himself on in America was far different, and far more dangerous than anything he had ever imagined. In the early days of his life in the United States, Bisola struggled to find his footing. The money that Chief Bisola Eleniyan had provided only went so far, and soon the harsh realities of immigrant life set in. He juggled odd jobs, barely managing to cover his tuition and living expenses. The American dream, it seemed, was more elusive than he had anticipated. But then, Bisola met Ada Oloja, a smooth-talking Mugulandian who seemed to embody everything Bisola had dreamed of. Ade was polished, wealthy, and well-connected. He exuded an air of danger and unpredictability that both intrigued and unsettled Bisola. "You want to make it here, my friend?" Ade had asked one night as they sat in a dimly lit bar, the sound of jazz music filling the air. "You need more than just hard work. You need connections. You need to understand how this city operates." Bisola listened intently, his eyes narrowing as Ade spoke. There was something captivating about the man, something that made him feel as though the impossible was within reach. "What kind of connections?" Bisola asked cautiously, sensing that this conversation was leading him down a path he hadn't intended to take. Ade leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The kind that can make you rich beyond your wildest dreams, my friend. The kind that can take you from struggling student to someone who commands respect." The allure of quick wealth and power was impossible to resist, and Bisola soon found himself drawn into a world of drug trafficking and money laundering. Ade introduced him to a network of Mugulandians who had established themselves as key players in the heroin trade that stretched from West Africa to the streets of Iyanla City. It was a dangerous game, but one that promised rewards beyond Bisola's wildest dreams. At first, Bisola was hesitant. He had come to America to study, to build a future through legitimate means. But as the pressures mounted, the bills piling up, the constant threat of deportation looming over him, he found himself increasingly tempted by the allure of easy money. "I don't know, Ade," Bisola had said one night as they sat in Ade's luxurious penthouse overlooking the city. "This isn't what I came here for." Ade had laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed off the walls. "You think the men at the top care how they got there? You think that they're all saints doing everything by the book? No, my friend. The world is built by those who take risks. You want to be a king, don't you? Then you have to be willing to play the game, and play the game Bisola did. He started small, running errands for Ade and his associates, handling money transfers and acting as a middleman in transactions. But as he proved himself reliable and discreet, his role within the network grew. He began to oversee larger operations, managing the flow of money through accounts he had set up under various aliases. It was during this time that Bisola decided to fully embrace his new identity. One evening, after a particularly lucrative transaction, Bisola found himself alone with Aid in the penthouse, the city lights twinkling below like a sea of stars. Bisola took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation he'd been rehearsing in his mind for days. "Aid, there's something I need to tell you," Bisola began, his voice steady but laced with tension. "I'm not Dauda Omolomo anymore. That name is dead to me." Aid raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh? And who are you now?" Bisola met his gaze, his eyes cold and resolute. "I'm Bisola Eleniyan. That's the name I want to be known by. It's the name I'm going to build my empire under." Aid studied him for a long moment, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Bisola Eleniyan, eh? Sounds powerful, but why the change?" "Dauda Omolomo was the name of a nobody," Bisola replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "A name tied to a past I'm leaving behind. Bisola Eleniyan is a name with a future, a name with connections. It's a name that commands respect." Aid nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "And what about your past, Bisola? You can't just erase it." "I can and I will," Bisola said, his jaw set with determination. "I've already started. I've destroyed every document that could link me to Dauda. I've contacted people back home, people who know how to make things disappear. Soon there won't be a single trace of Dauda Omolomo left." Aid leaned back in his chair, a look of admiration on his face. "You've thought this through, haven't you? I have to say, Bisola Eleniyan has a nice ring to it. It suits you." Bisola allowed himself a small smile. "From now on, that's who I am, and I won't allow anything or anyone to get in the way of that." Aid raised his glass in a toast to Bisola Eleniyan. May he rise to the top and take everything he desires. They clinked glasses, the sound of the toast echoing through the penthouse. But even as they celebrated, Bisola's mind was already racing ahead, plotting his next move. The transformation from Dauda Omolomo to Bisola Eleniyan was more than just a change of name. It was a rebirth, a shedding of an old identity that no longer served him. Bisola was determined to build a new life, one where he was not just a player in the game of power, but the one calling the shots. As he walked out of Aid's penthouse that night, the cold wind biting at his face, Bisola knew that he had crossed a line, one that he could never return from, but he didn't look back. The path ahead was clear, and it was one that only Bisola Eleniyan could walk. The next day, Bisola made his final move to erase Dauda Omolomo from existence. He visited the offices of a shady private investigator who specialized in cleaning up records. With a substantial payment, Bisola ensured that all traces of Dauda Omolomo's existence, birth records, school transcripts, even immigration documents, were expunged, altered, or buried so deep that no one would ever find them. "Consider it done," the investigator had said, pocketing the envelope of cash Bisola had handed him. "From now on, you're Bisola Eleniyan. As far as anyone's concerned, Dauda Omolomo never existed." As Bisola left the office, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was no longer tied to the past, no longer burdened by the identity of a man who was destined for mediocrity. Bisola Eleniyan was a name that would be known, feared, and respected, and he would stop at nothing to ensure that it was. The city of Alaye City, with all its opportunities and dangers, had given Bisola the tools he needed to become who he was meant to be, but it was time to leave it behind. His true destiny awaited him in Alaye City. As the city faded into the distance, Bisola knew that the game was far from over. It was only just beginning, and this time he would play to win, no matter the cost.
Episode 3. The Drug Bust and the Narrow Escape. The clang of the cell door closing behind him echoed in Bisola Eleniyan's ears, reverberating through his bones. The sound was cold, final, and it sent a chill down his spine. He sat on the edge of the narrow cot, staring at the grey concrete walls that had become his world for the past few days. The sterile, suffocating air of the holding cell was a far cry from the luxurious penthouses and sleek offices where he had conducted his business. Bisola had always known the risks. In the back of his mind, he had been aware that the empire he was building was precariously perched on the edge of legality. But he had been careful, meticulous even, to stay just out of reach of the law, or so he thought. It had all unraveled so quickly. The early morning raid, the flash of badges, the harsh commands of the FBI agents as they stormed his apartment. Bisola had barely had time to register what was happening before he was cuffed and dragged into the back of a police car, his rights read to him in a cold monotone. The charges were severe: money laundering, conspiracy to distribute heroin, aiding and abetting a criminal enterprise. The words had fallen like a guillotine, cutting through any illusions Bisola might have harbored about his invincibility. He had been careful, but not careful enough. The authorities had been watching Akim Oloja's network for months, building a case, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now they had their prize. A major player in the operation, someone who could give them the names and connections they needed to dismantle the entire organization. As Bisola sat in that cell, the weight of his predicament settled over him like a shroud. The prospect of spending the rest of his life in an American prison loomed large, suffocating him with its finality. The money, the power, the connections, they all meant nothing now. He was just another inmate, just another cog in the machine of the American justice system. The door to his cell creaked open, and a guard stepped in, nodding toward Bisola. "Your lawyer's here," he said, his tone devoid of any warmth or empathy. Bisola stood, his legs unsteady beneath him, and followed the guard down the narrow corridor to a small, windowless room. There, sitting at a metal table, was his lawyer, a man with a stern, weathered face, dressed in a crisp suit that seemed out of place in the drab surroundings. "Mr. Eleniyan," the lawyer greeted him, standing to shake his hand. "Please, have a seat." Bisola sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them together on the table. The lawyer wasted no time, pulling out a folder and laying it on the table in front of him. "We have a problem," the lawyer said, his voice low and serious. "The government has built a solid case against you. They have records of your financial transactions, witness statements and surveillance footage. If this goes to trial, the chances of acquittal are slim." Bisola felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What are my options?" he asked, his voice strained. The lawyer hesitated for a moment, then opened the folder, revealing a stack of papers. "The U.S. Attorney's Office is willing to offer you a deal. It's not ideal, but it's the best we're going to get." Bisola's eyes narrowed as he looked at the documents. "A deal? A plea bargain?" the lawyer explained. "You plead guilty to a lesser charge of money laundering, and in exchange, the other charges are dropped. You forfeit the funds in your accounts, but you avoid a lengthy prison sentence." "How long?" Bisola asked, his heart pounding in his chest. "Time served," the lawyer replied, "plus probation. But you'll be free to go." The words hung in the air, almost surreal in their simplicity. Free to go. After everything, after all the risks he had taken, it seemed impossible that he could walk away from this with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. But the lawyer's expression was grave, his eyes sharp and calculating. "This is your best option, Mr. Eleniyan," the lawyer continued. "You take this deal, or you roll the dice in court. But I'm telling you now, if this goes to trial, the odds are not in your favor." Bisola's mind raced, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had always been a gambler, willing to take risks for the promise of greater rewards. But this was different. This was his life, his freedom, hanging in the balance. He looked up at the lawyer, his expression hardening with resolve. "I'll take the deal." The lawyer nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. "Good. I'll make the arrangements. You'll be out of here by the end of the week." As the lawyer gathered the papers, Bisola sat back in his chair, his thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had narrowly escaped a fate that could have destroyed him, but the cost was steep. The money he had worked so hard to amass was gone, forfeited to the US government. And with it, the empire he had begun to build in America had crumbled before it could even take shape. But as the initial shock faded, a new resolve began to take root in Bisola's mind. America had been a stepping stone, a place where he had learned the ropes, honed his skills and made connections. But it was never meant to be the end game. No. The end game was back in Eleniyan City, back in Muguland, where he could leverage everything he had learned to build something far greater. The name Bisola Eleniyan would not end in a prison cell. It would rise to new heights, more powerful than ever before. The following week, as Bisola stepped out of the courthouse, a free man, the cold wind of Eleniyan City biting at his face, he knew that this was a turning point. He had played with fire and had almost been burned, but he had survived. And now, with the lessons learned and the scars to prove it, he was ready to return to Eleniyan City and claim what was rightfully his. As he made his way through the bustling streets, the towering buildings of Seattle fading into the background, Bisola's mind was already racing ahead. He would return to Muguland, but he would do so as a different man. A man who had seen the worst the world had to offer, and had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. The game was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning, and this time, Bisola Eleniyan would play to win, no matter the cost.
The news of Chief Bisola Eleniyan's death swept through Eleniyan City like the Harmattan wind, dry and unrelenting. For decades, the chief had been a towering figure in the city's political landscape, a man whose influence stretched across the length and breadth of Muguland. To many, he was a father, a mentor, a kingmaker. To Bisola Eleniyan, he had been all that and more, a guiding hand, a protector, and the man who had given him a name and a purpose. The funeral rites were held in a grand yet austere manner befitting a man of Chief Eleniyan's stature and faith. The mosque was packed to the rafters with dignitaries, political elites, business magnates, and community leaders, all gathered to pay their respects. The air was thick with the solemn recitations of the Quran, the rhythmic cadence of the verses echoing through the sacred space as the chief imam of Eleniyan City led the prayers. Bisola sat among the mourners, his head bowed, his heart heavy. The loss of his mentor left a void that was as deep as it was unexpected. The chief had been the anchor in his life, the man who had helped him navigate the treacherous waters of Eleniyan City politics. Without him, Bisola knew he would need to be even more vigilant, even more ruthless if he was to survive and thrive in the cutthroat world he had chosen. After the prayers, the chief's body was carried out of the mosque, wrapped in simple white cloth, as per Islamic tradition. The burial was swift, dignified, and devoid of the extravagance that so often marked the passing of the powerful in Muguland. The simplicity of the ceremony only underscored the profound respect in which Chief Eleniyan was held. As the last shovelful of earth was placed on the grave, the mourners began to disperse, their faces solemn, their voices hushed. Bisola lingered, staring at the freshly turned soil, struggling to come to terms with the finality of it all. He was alone with his thoughts when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "You're not alone, Bisola." The voice was soft yet commanding, a voice that Bisola had come to respect and fear. He turned to see Iyanla Eleniyan standing a few feet away, her regal presence impossible to ignore. Dressed in a flowing black abaya, her head wrapped in a matching hijab, she looked every inch the matron of Eleniyan City's most powerful family. "Iyanla," Bisola said, bowing his head in respect as she approached. I didn't expect to see you here alone." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the cool calculation of someone who had seen and survived it all. "Chief may be gone, but I'm still here, and as long as I'm here, so are you." Bisola frowned slightly, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Iyanla, what do you mean?" Iyanla Eleniyan stepped closer, her gaze piercing as she looked up at him. Despite her age, there was a strength in her eyes that Bisola found both reassuring and intimidating. "You've done well for yourself, Bisola, better than most would have in your position. But don't forget where you came from, and don't forget who helped you get where you are." Bisola felt a pang of unease. "Iyanla, I don't understand." She took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing as she searched his face. "Let me make it clear for you, Bisola, all those dealings you had in Seattle, in Atlanta, all the way to Seattle, all the connections you made, Akeem Oloja, the money, the trade, they were mine." Bisola's eyes widened, shock rendering him momentarily speechless. "What? But how?" Iyanla's smile returned, this time tinged with something more sinister. "Akeem Oloja was one of mine, just as you were. You thought you were building something on your own, but in reality you've been under my wing the entire time. I knew where you were, who you were meeting, and what deals you were making. It was all part of the plan." Bisola's mind reeled, The realization that he had been manipulated, that every move he'd made had been anticipated and orchestrated by the woman standing before him, was staggering. Why? Why didn't you tell me? Because you needed to prove yourself, Iyanla replied, her tone unyielding. Chief saw potential in you, but I needed to see if you could survive on your own, if you could handle the pressure, the risks. You did, and you've done well. But now that Chief is gone, you answer to me. Bisola's shock began to morph into something else. Admiration, respect, and a growing sense of resolve. Iyanla, I didn't know. No, you didn't, she said, her voice softening slightly. But you know now. Chief may have given you the name, but I gave you the means. You've been working for me from the moment you set foot in Seattle, USA. Bisola swallowed hard, the gravity of her words sinking in. And what now, Iyanla? What do you expect from me? Iyanla Eleniyan looked out over the grave, the cool evening breeze rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. What I expect, Bisola, is loyalty. The kind of loyalty that goes beyond mere words. You've proven yourself capable, but now you need to prove yourself trustworthy. Alea City is a dangerous place, and with Chief gone, there are those who will try to take what's ours. I need to know that you will stand with me, that you will be the force I need to keep them at bay. Bisola nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Iyanla, you have my loyalty. I've come this far, and I'm not about to stop now. Whatever you need, whatever it takes, I'm with you. She turned to him, a genuine smile breaking through her usually stern expression. Good, because we're just getting started, Bisola. The power you've tasted in Seattle, USA, was just the beginning. Alea City is where the real game is played, and with you by my side, we're going to take control of this city and beyond. As they stood there side by side, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in twilight. In that moment, Bisola knew that his path had changed yet again. He was no longer just a man climbing the ladder of power. He was a key player in a much larger game, one that had been set in motion long before he'd ever realized. Iyanla Eleniyan was more than just a matron. She was the true power behind the throne, the woman who had shaped the man he had become. And now, with her at his side, there was nothing they couldn't achieve. Together, they would rule Alea City, and then Muguland, and woe to anyone who dared to stand in their way.
Episode 5, Kingmaker of Muguland, The Rise of Iyanla, by Dr. Opie Banwo. Before Bisola Eleniyan emerged as a force in Alea City, there was Iyanla Eleniyan, a name whispered with reverence and fear throughout the city. While her husband, Chief Bisola Eleniyan, was the public face of political power, it was Iyanla who ruled the city from the shadows. Her dominion extended beyond the affluent neighborhoods of Kokoyi and Prince Charles Island into the very heart of Alea City. Its markets, where the lifeblood of the city flowed through the hands of the market women she commanded. Iyanla's influence was rooted in her early life, growing up in the bustling markets of Alea City. Born to a family of traders, she quickly rose through the ranks, becoming the undisputed leader of the market women, a position of immense power. The market women were the backbone of the city's economy, controlling the flow of goods, money, and information. And under Iyanla's leadership, they became a formidable force, one that even the most powerful politicians in Muguland dared not cross. It was said that Iyanla had eyes and ears in every corner of Alea City. The market women were not just traders, they were her informants, her enforcers, and her loyal soldiers. With their support, she could sway elections, crush her enemies, and elevate those who were loyal to her. It was this network that gave her an unparalleled reach, extending her influence far beyond what anyone could have imagined. When Bisola Eleniyan came into the picture, Iyanla saw something in him, a spark of ambition, a hunger for power that reminded her of herself. She took him under her wing, grooming him not just as her protege, but as the heir to her vast, visible and invisible empire. But Alea City was not a city that easily accepted outsiders, and Bisola's rise was met with resistance from those who resented his presence.
Episode 6, The Kingmaker of Muguland, The Wrath of Iyanla. The first significant challenge to Bisola's legitimacy in Alea City came from a faction of indigenes, men and women who had been born and bred in the Alaya city and saw themselves as the rightful heirs to Iyanla's favor. They viewed Bisola, who hailed from Yemoja city, in the far west of Muguland, as an outsider, an interloper who had no claim to the power that Iyanla wielded. Their resentment simmered just beneath the surface, manifesting in whispers of dissent and thinly veiled threats. But Iyanla was not a woman to be trifled with. She had built her empire through a combination of shrewdness, brutality, and an unyielding will. The market women who owed their livelihoods to her were her most loyal subjects. They were the ones who controlled the city's economy, and they were the ones who ensured that Iyanla's word was law. She called a meeting with the leaders of the market women, gathering them in a grand hall that overlooked the city she had shaped. The women arrived in their brightly coloured IRO and buba, their faces etched with a mix of respect and apprehension. Iyanla stood at the head of the room, her presence commanding and regal. "My sisters," she began, her voice carrying the weight of authority, "Alay city is our city. We have built it with our hands and we have defended it with our strength. But there are those who would challenge our rule, who would seek to undermine the power we have fought so hard to secure." The women murmured in agreement, their eyes fixed on Iyanla. "There are those," Iyanla continued, her voice growing colder, "who believe that because Bisola was not born in Alaya city, he has no place here. They forget that I am the one who decides who belongs in this city, and I have chosen Bisola as my heir." One of the women, a respected leader among the market traders, stepped forward. "Iyanla, we are with you, but the men are stirring trouble. They say we should not follow a man who is not one of us." Iyanla's eyes flashed with anger. "The men," she spat, "will do as they are told, or they will face the consequences." The room fell silent as Iyanla's words hung in the air like a guillotine. "We built this city," she said, her voice steady and cold, "and we will not let a few jealous men tear it down. Bisola is my chosen, and anyone who challenges him challenges me." With that, Iyanla turned to one of her lieutenants, a formidable woman named Alhaja Tinuola Gawanje, who controlled the largest market in Alaya city. "Tinu, you know what needs to be done?" Alhaji Tinuola Gawanje nodded grimly. "Consider it done, Iyanla." The retribution that followed was swift and merciless. The market women, under Alhaja Gawanje's command, mobilized like an army. They spread through the city, shutting down the stalls of those who dared to oppose Iyanla's will, seizing goods and delivering harsh warnings to anyone who spoke against Bisola. The streets of Alay city buzzed with fear as the message became clear. Iyanla's rule was absolute, and Bisola was her chosen successor. But Iyanla wasn't finished. She knew that fear alone wouldn't be enough to secure Bisola's place in the city. She needed to show that he had the support of Alay city's true power brokers, the market women. In a grand gesture, Iyanla organized a public event, a celebration in the heart of the city's largest market. Thousands of people gathered to see the spectacle, the air filled with the sounds of drumming, singing, and the bustling of traders. At the center of it all stood Iyanla and Bisola side by side. As the crowd swelled around them, Iyanla raised her hands, calling for silence. "Alay city," she called out, her voice carrying over the noise. "This is my son, Bisola Eleniyan. He is not just an heir to the Eleniyan name, he is an heir to Alay city itself. From this day forward, he is one of us." The crowd erupted in cheers, the sound reverberating through the market. The market women, led by Alhaja Tinuola Gawanje, chanted Bisola's name, their voices rising in unison. It was a declaration, a public anointing that left no room for doubt. Bisola was now a legitimate power in Alaya city. As the celebrations continued, Iyanla leaned in close to Bisola, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Do you see now, Bisola? Power is not given. It is snatched by the brave and taken by the courageous. And when it is taken, it must be held with an iron grip. You have that grip now. Do not let it go." Bisola nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a mantle. "I won't forget, Iyanla. I'll make sure of it." She smiled, a rare expression that softened her otherwise hardened features. "Good, because Alay city is ours, and anyone who challenges us will face the full wrath of the market." As the night wore on, and the celebrations continued, Bisola felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead would be dangerous, filled with enemies and obstacles, but with Iyanla and the market women by his side, he also knew that there was nothing they couldn't achieve together. Alaye City had tried to reject him, but he had been legitimized by the most powerful woman in the city. Now it was time to claim what was his, and he would do so with the full force of Iyanla Eleniyan's visible and invisible empire behind him. In the brutal world of Alaye City, power was everything, and Bisola Eleniyan was prepared to wield it with the same ruthlessness that had earned him his place at Iyanla's side.
Episode 7. The Kingmaker of Muguland, The Rise of Bisola Eleniyan, by Dr. Ope Banwo. Bisola Eleniyan had always known that the world of Alaye City was a jungle, where the strong devoured the weak and the cunning ruled over the unsuspecting. But it wasn't enough to merely survive in such an environment. To truly thrive, one had to demonstrate a capacity for ruthlessness that left no doubt as to who was in control. For Bisola, proving himself as a worthy heir to Iyanla's empire required more than just loyalty. It required action, decisive and brutal when necessary. The first test came in the form of Alhaji Durojaye, a longtime ally of Chief Musibao Eleniyan, who had transitioned into an uneasy partnership with Iyanla after the chief's death. Durojaye was a wealthy businessman with extensive connections in the oil and gas sector, but his ambitions had always been curbed by his loyalty to the Eleniyan family. However, with Chief gone and Iyanla's attention seemingly focused on solidifying Bisola's position, Durojaye began to entertain thoughts of breaking free from the Eleniyan influence. What Durojaye didn't realize was that Iyanla had eyes and ears everywhere. She knew of his growing discontent and had been waiting for the right moment to address it. Bisola, sensing an opportunity to prove himself, volunteered to handle the situation personally. "Iyanla," Bisola had said during a late-night meeting in her study, "let me deal with Durojaye. He needs to understand that loyalty is not an option, it's a requirement." Iyanla studied him, her gaze as sharp as ever. "And what do you propose to do, Bisola?" Bisola smiled, a cold, calculated expression. "I'll remind him of the cost of betrayal, but I'll do it in a way that leaves no trace of our involvement." Over the next few days, Bisola set his plan into motion. He began by subtly planting the seeds of doubt within Durojaye's inner circle, using his network of informants to suggest that the businessman was planning to defect to a rival faction. The rumors spread like wildfire, eroding the trust Durojaye's allies had in him. Then, on a quiet evening, Bisola invited Durojaye to a private meeting in a luxurious but discreet location, a penthouse suite in one of Alaye City's most exclusive hotels. Durojaye arrived, eager to discuss what he believed was a lucrative business opportunity. As they sat down over drinks, Bisola leaned in, his voice smooth and reassuring. "Alhaji, you've been a valuable partner to our family. I know you're ambitious, and I respect that, but ambition must be tempered with loyalty." Durojaye, sensing the underlying threat, tried to maintain his composure. "Bisola, I have always been loyal to the Eleniyan family. My only concern is ensuring that my business continues to thrive." Bisola nodded, a slight smile playing on his lips. "I understand, Alhaji, but there's a problem. I've been hearing things that suggest you're not as committed to our partnership as you once were." Durojaye's eyes widened, fear creeping into his voice. "Bisola, I assure you those are just rumors. I would never betray your family." Bisola's smile disappeared, his expression hardening. "I hope for your sake that's true, because betrayal is something I and Iyanla Eleniyan cannot tolerate." With that, Bisola signaled to one of his men, who handed him a file. Bisola opened it, revealing documents that implicated Durojaye in a series of financial irregularities. Irregularities that could easily be turned over to the authorities, ruining him both financially and socially. Durojaye's face paled as he realized the depth of the trap Bisola had set for him. What do you want?" he stammered. Bisola closed the file and leaned back in his chair. I want your complete and unconditional loyalty, Al-Haji. From this moment on, you answer to me. Fail to do so, and these documents find their way to the authorities. Do we understand each other? Durojaye, his hands trembling, nodded. Yes, Bisola, I understand. Good, Bisola said, standing up and extending his hand. I'm glad we could clear this up. The handshake was brief, cold, and final. As Durojaye left the suite, Bisola knew that he had secured not just the man's loyalty, but also his fear, a far more potent tool in the world of Alaye City power plays. When Bisola reported back to Iyanla, she listened intently, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she simply nodded, a hint of approval in her eyes. You've done well, Bisola, she said. Durojaye was becoming a problem. Now he's a tool you forged yourself. The second test came from within the ranks of the market women themselves. Ramota Olorikunkun, a charismatic leader of one of the city's largest markets, had long been a staunch supporter of Iyanla. But as Bisola began to take on a more prominent role, Ramota grew resentful. She believed that her years of service entitled her to more influence, more control. She began to sow discord among the market women, questioning Bisola's legitimacy and hinting that perhaps it was time for a change in leadership. Word of Ramota's discontent reached Bisola, who decided to handle the matter directly. Unlike Durojaye, Ramota Olorikunkun's power base was deeply rooted in the community, making a direct confrontation more dangerous. Bisola needed to be more subtle, more strategic. He started by quietly gathering information on Ramota, her weaknesses, her vulnerabilities. It didn't take long to find one. Ramota had a son, a young man who had recently fallen into bad company, associating with a gang of area boys involved in drug trafficking. It was the leverage Bisola needed. One afternoon, Bisola arranged a meeting with Madame Ramota in one of the markets, under the preteens of discussing business. As they walked through the bustling stalls, Bisola spoke calmly, his tone measured. Madame Ramota, I've heard that you've been speaking out against me. Bisola began, not bothering with pleasantries. Ramota, taken aback by the directness of the accusation, quickly masked her surprise with a defiant expression. Bisola, I've only spoken the truth. The market women deserve a leader who understands them, someone who was born here, who shares their struggles. Bisola stopped walking and turned to face her, his eyes cold. And you think you're that leader? Ramota met his gaze, her chin raised defiantly. I've earned my place. I've served Iyanla for years. I've bled for these markets, and I don't intend to let an outsider take what belongs to us. Bisola nodded slowly, as if considering her words. Then he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. Your son, Madame Ramota. I know what he's been up to. Ramota's defiant expression faltered, a flicker of fear crossing her face. What do you mean? I know about the gang, Bisola continued, his tone almost casual. I know about the drugs, the debts. The authorities would be very interested in that information. Ramota's eyes widened in horror. Bisola, please, he's just a boy. He's made mistakes, but he doesn't deserve... Bisola held up a hand, cutting her off. I'm not here to ruin your son's life, Madame Ramota, but I will if I have to. All I want is your loyalty. Swear it to me now, and your son's troubles disappear. Madame Ramota's resolve crumbled as she realized the position she was in. She had no choice. You have my loyalty, Bisola. I swear it. Bisola smiled, the warmth of it never reaching his eyes. Good, because I have no need for enemies, madam. Only allies. With that, the meeting was over. Madame Ramota, defeated and broken, left the market, knowing that she had lost not only the battle, but her future as a leader among the market women. Bisola had outmaneuvered her, using her greatest vulnerability against her. It was a lesson she would never forget. When Bisola reported his success to Iyanla, she listened in silence, her expression thoughtful. You've learned quickly, Bisola, she said finally. But remember this, power is not just about crushing your enemies. It's about knowing when to show mercy, when to let someone live so that they serve you. You did well with Ramota. She will be more useful to us now than she ever was before. Bisola nodded, understanding the deeper lesson Iyanla was imparting. I'll remember, Iyanla, and I'll continue to prove myself worthy of the trust you've placed in me. As he left Iyanla's presence that night, Bisola knew that he had crossed another threshold. He was no longer just a protege. He was becoming a force in his own right, a man who could command loyalty and instill fear with equal ease. The streets of Alaye City were treacherous, but Bisola Eleniyan was proving that he was more than capable of navigating them. Episode 8: The Kingmaker of Muguland, The Power of Generosity. In the ruthless world of Alaye City politics, where loyalty was often bought and sold, Bisola Eleniyan distinguished himself not just through cunning and ruthlessness, but also through an unmatched genius for generosity. He understood that power wasn't solely maintained through fear and control. It was also nurtured through loyalty, born of gratitude and mutual respect. Bisola's brand of generosity was legendary, creating a network of devoted followers who saw him not just as a leader, but as a benefactor who genuinely cared for their well-being. It was the Eid al-Adha, the festival of sacrifice, one of the most significant holidays in Muguland. For weeks, Alaye City had been buzzing with preparations, and as the day approached, the market women, the area boys, and the political operatives who formed the backbone of Bisola's network waited in anticipation. They knew that Bisola was not one to forget his people, especially during such a significant time. On the eve of the festival, Bisola's men began to move through the city, delivering gifts that would become the talk of Alaye City. Each lieutenant received a package, a large sum of money, a sack of rice, and a cow. The cows, specially selected, were of the highest quality, a symbol of both sacrifice and abundance. But it wasn't just the value of the gifts that mattered, it was the way they were delivered. Each package came with a personal note from Bisola, written in his own hand, wishing the recipient and their family a blessed festival. The notes were short but heartfelt, reminding each person that they were more than just subordinates. They were part of a larger family. When the news spread that Bisola had personally ensured that each of his key supporters was well taken care of, the effect was electric. The market women, who had always been fiercely loyal to Iyanla, now saw Bisola as more than just her heir. He was a leader who cared for them, who remembered them even in times of joy. The area boys, who respected strength but also valued respect, found in Bisola a benefactor who did not look down on them, but treated them with the dignity they craved. As the festival unfolded, Alaye City was filled with the sounds of celebration. But in every corner of the city, from the crowded markets to the quiet alleys, one name was on everyone's lips: Bisola Eleniyan. His generosity had cemented his place not just as a man of power, but as a man of the people. Not all acts of generosity were grand public gestures. Some were quiet, personal moments that revealed the depth of Bisola's understanding of the power of gratitude. One such moment came when Bisola learned of a widow, Mama Rise Eleniyan, who had once been a close confidant of Iyanla, but had fallen on hard times after her husband's death. Mama Rise Eleniyan's market stall had been struggling, and without a male figure in her family, she had no one to advocate for her in the often brutal world of Alaye City commerce. When Bisola heard of her plight, he acted swiftly and discreetly. He sent one of his trusted aides to visit Mama Rise, delivering a small fortune in cash, enough to settle her debts, restock her stall, and secure her future. But that wasn't all. Bisola also arranged for her son to receive an apprenticeship with one of the city's most respected merchants, ensuring that the family would have a steady income and a chance to rebuild. When Mama Rise Eleniyan received the aid, she was overwhelmed with gratitude. She had expected to be forgotten, a casualty of the city's unforgiving nature. But Bisola's gesture showed her, and others, that he was a leader who did not forget those who had served his family, even when they could no longer serve him directly. Word of Bisola's act spread quietly but surely through the markets, reinforcing the idea that Bisola was a man who remembered his roots, a man who cared for the vulnerable as much as the powerful. Mama Rise Eleniyan's story became a symbol of hope for many in Alaye City, a reminder that in a city often devoid of compassion, there was still room for kindness. The final act that solidified Bisola's reputation for generosity came when he sponsored the education of a young, brilliant scholar from a poor background. The boy, Adisa Eg Iwe, had shown exceptional talent in mathematics and engineering. but had no means to pursue higher education. When Bisola heard of Adisa's plight through one of his aides, he saw an opportunity to change the boy's life and to reinforce his own legacy as a patron of the future. Without hesitation, Bisola arranged for a full scholarship, covering not only Adisa Igiiwe's tuition, but also his living expenses and a generous stipend. But Bisola's involvement didn't stop there. He personally visited Adisa's family, assuring them that the boy's future was secure and that he would have every opportunity to succeed. "Your son," Bisola had said to Adisa's mother, "is not just a blessing to you but to all of us. He will make us proud, and I will make sure of it." Adisa's mother wept tears of joy, and the story of Bisola's sponsorship spread quickly through the city. It wasn't just the act of generosity that impressed people. It was the personal involvement. The way Bisola had taken the time to meet the family, to understand their struggles, and to offer not just financial support, but emotional reassurance. As Adisa Igiiwe excelled in his studies, his success became a testament to Bisola's vision and generosity. The boy's story was told and retold in the markets, in the streets, and in the corridors of power. Bisola had not just sponsored a student, he had invested in the future of Alaye City. And in doing so, he had secured the loyalty and admiration of countless families who saw in him a leader who truly cared. These acts of generosity, public and private, grand and humble, were not just gestures. They were strategic moves in Bisola's rise to power. By giving generously and personally, Bisola created a network of loyalty that was rooted not just in fear or obligation, but in genuine gratitude. His followers saw him as more than a benefactor. They saw him as a protector, a leader who remembered them in times of both hardship and celebration. As Bisola's influence grew, so did the stories of his generosity, each one reinforcing the legend of a man who knew that power was not just about control, it was about creating a bond with the people who supported him. In a city like Alaye City, where power was often maintained through intimidation, Bisola's approach was refreshingly different. He knew that while fear could command obedience, it was love and loyalty that would make people willing to fight, and even die, for him. One of the most dramatic examples of Bisola's strategic generosity came when he rescued a loyal supporter from ruin, an act that would solidify his reputation as a leader who never forgot his own. Okoro was an area boy who had risen through the ranks to become one of Bisola's most trusted enforcers. Fiercely loyal, Okoro had carried out numerous missions for Bisola, often at great personal risk. However, a botched operation led to Okoro being caught and imprisoned. The charges against him were severe, and the likelihood of his release seemed slim. Many in Alaye City whispered that Okoro was finished, that his loyalty to Bisola had cost him his freedom. But Bisola was not one to abandon those who had served him faithfully. He moved quickly and quietly, pulling strings within the police force, leveraging his political connections, and when necessary, offering substantial bribes to secure Okoro's release. It wasn't just about freeing Okoro. It was about sending a message to everyone in his network that Bisola stood by his people, no matter the cost. When Okoro was released from prison, he was a shadow of his former self, broken by the experience. But Bisola personally visited him, offering not just words of encouragement, but the resources to rebuild his life. He arranged for Okoro to start a legitimate business, providing him with the capital and support needed to get back on his feet. "Okoro," Bisola had said during one of their meetings, "you've always been loyal to me, and I'll never forget that. Alaye City is a hard place, but you don't have to fight alone. I've got your back, just like you've always had mine." The story of Okoro's redemption quickly spread through Alaye City. It became a symbol of Bisola's unwavering loyalty to those who were loyal to him. It was clear to everyone that in Bisola, they had not just a leader, but a protector, someone who would not abandon them even in their darkest hour. Bisola's most spectacular act of generosity came during one of Alaye City's annual festivals, known as the Festival of Light. The festival, which celebrated the city's rich cultural heritage, was a time of joy, unity, and remembrance. Traditionally, it was funded by the city government and local businesses, but in a year when economic hardships had hit Alaye City particularly hard, Funding was scarce, and there were talks of canceling the festival. Bisola saw an opportunity to not only save the festival, but to elevate it to new heights. He personally financed the entire event, sparing no expense. The markets were filled with food and drink, all provided for free to the people of Eleniyan City. Streets were adorned with colorful lights, and musicians, dancers, and performers were hired to entertain the crowds. But it was the grand finale that truly left a lasting impression. As the final night of the festival approached, Bisola organized a massive fireworks display, the likes of which had never been seen in Eleniyan City. The sky was lit up with brilliant colors, each explosion accompanied by cheers and applause from the thousands of people who had gathered to watch. As the fireworks illuminated the night sky, Bisola stood on a stage, addressing the crowd with a voice that carried both authority and warmth. "This festival is for all of us," he said. "It's a reminder that no matter the challenges we face, we are one people, one city. Eleniyan City is our home, and as long as I am here, I will do everything in my power to ensure that we continue to thrive, together." The festival ended with a standing ovation, and in the days that followed, stories of Bisola's generosity spread throughout the city. The people saw in him a leader who was not only capable of great power, but also of great kindness. He had given them something more valuable than money. He had given them hope and a sense of unity in a time of hardship. Bisola's genius in using generosity to build loyalty and power in Eleniyan City was unmatched. He understood that while fear could command, generosity could inspire. Through acts large and small, he created a web of loyalty that extended from the highest echelons of power to the most humble corners of the city. But this generosity was not without purpose. Every gift, every act of kindness, was a strategic move in a larger game. Bisola knew that true power came from the hearts of the people, and by winning their loyalty through generosity, he secured a foundation of support that would carry him through the challenges that lay ahead. As Bisola's reputation grew, so did his influence, and with Iyanla's continued guidance, he became not just a feared leader, but a beloved one, a man whose name was synonymous with power, loyalty, and the unwavering support of those who called Eleniyan City their home. Episode 9. Kingmaker of Muguland, Rise of General Bacha-Bacha. The year was 1995, and Muguland was under the iron grip of General Bacha-Bacha, a ruthless military dictator who had seized power from the interim government led by Chief Vincent Sholojo. The streets of Eleniyan City and the rest of the country were filled with fear, uncertainty, and the stench of oppression. General Bacha-Bacha, whose full name was General Sunday Abubakar Bacha-Bacha, ruled with a stranglehold, crushing any semblance of dissent and eliminating anyone who dared to oppose his regime. Bacha-Bacha's rise to power had been swift and brutal. After toppling the interim government, he declared himself the supreme leader of Muguland, suspending the constitution, dissolving the National Assembly, and unleashing his military might on the populace. Political opponents, activists, and journalists were jailed, tortured, or worse, as Bacha-Bacha's regime tightened its grip on every aspect of life in the country. Bisola Eleniyan, who had been steadily rising in the political and economic circles of Eleniyan City, quickly found himself on the wrong side of the new regime. As someone who had always been vocal about his commitment to democracy and the rule of law, Bisola was immediately marked as a threat to Bacha-Bacha's authoritarian rule. Bisola had seen the writing on the wall even before Bacha-Bacha's coup. He knew that the military's return to power would spell disaster for anyone who had built their influence outside the confines of the barracks. Sensing the danger, he began to quietly prepare for the worst, putting contingency plans in place to protect his assets and his life. When the crackdown began, Bisola's name was on the list of those to be silenced. But he was not one to wait for the hammer to fall.
Episode 10. The Great Escape into Exile. The walls were closing in on Bisola Eleniyan. The streets of Eleniyan City, once familiar and safe, had become a treacherous labyrinth of danger. General Bacha-Bacha's regime was relentless, and Bisola knew that his time in Muguland was running out. The crackdown had begun, and with each passing day the net around him tightened. Every ally that could be bought was being surveyed, and every escape route was being watched. Bisola needed to get out, and fast. But Bisola was not a man who panicked. He was a master of strategy, and he had anticipated this moment. He had a plan, one that required both audacity and deception. To escape from Bacha-Bacha's grasp, Bisola would need to pull off the most daring feat of his life: the audacious disguise. As dawn approached, Bisola prepared for his escape. His most trusted confidants were already in position, each knowing their role to play in what was about to be the most dangerous game of his life. In a dimly lit room in a safe house deep within Iyanla City, Bisola stood before a mirror, transforming himself. Gone was the commanding presence of the political kingpin. In his place stood a woman, dressed in a flowing, brightly coloured bubu, with a headscarf wrapped tightly around his head, concealing his distinctive features. The makeup, the accessories, even the way he carried himself, it was all meticulously crafted to ensure that anyone who saw him would think they were looking at a wealthy, middle-aged woman, perhaps a merchant or a relative visiting from the countryside. The disguise was perfect, but Bisola knew it wasn't enough to fool the secret military pixies who had been shadowing him for days. He needed more than just a disguise. He needed to throw them off his trail entirely. The brilliant decoy. Bisola's plan involved a decoy, another car identical to the one he was known to use, filled with men who were in on the ruse. They would take the usual route to the airport, creating the illusion that Bisola was making a desperate dash to escape by air. The decoy car would be deliberately conspicuous, speeding through the streets, drawing attention from anyone watching. The men in the decoy car were nervous, but Bisola had assured them that they were playing a crucial role in his escape. "You're saving my life," he had told them, his voice calm and steady, "and I'll never forget it." As the decoy car roared out of the safe house's hidden garage, the military pixies took the bait, following closely behind. The car sped through the city with the pixies in hot pursuit, believing they had their target cornered. The decoy car led them on a wild chase, evading capture but never quite losing them, keeping the attention of Bacha-Bacha's men firmly focused on the wrong target. The motorcycle and escape through the bushes. While the decoy car caused chaos in the streets, Bisola made his move. Dressed in his disguise, he slipped out of the safe house and headed toward a nondescript alley, where a trusted ally awaited him with a motorcycle. The ally was an experienced rider, known for his ability to navigate the most challenging terrain, a skill that would be vital in the hours ahead. Without a word, Bisola mounted the motorcycle behind the rider, his disguise still firmly in place. The motorcycle roared to life, and within moments they were weaving through the back streets of Iyanla City, moving away from the city and toward the dense bushes that bordered the Republic of Chronicles. The ride was harrowing. The narrow paths they took were little more than animal trails winding through dense vegetation, treacherous ravines and hidden streams. The rider pushed the motorcycle to its limits, dodging obstacles and keeping a relentless pace, knowing that any delay could mean disaster. But Bisola remained calm, his grip steady, his mind focused on the journey ahead. He knew that this was the only way to evade capture, by going where no car could follow, through the wilderness that separated Muguland from Chronicles land. Hours passed, and with each mile, Bisola felt the weight of the city, the danger, the tension, gradually lift from his shoulders. The roar of the motorcycle was the only sound in the otherwise silent bush, the thick foliage closing in around them like a protective shroud. Crossing the border through the Black River. Finally, as the sun began to set, they reached the border. It was a remote crossing, one known only to smugglers and those who operated on the fringes of society. There were no official checkpoints, no guards, only the natural boundary between two countries, marked by a thin meandering river. The rider slowed the motorcycle as they approached the crossing, allowing Bisola to dismount. For a moment, Bisola stood there, taking in the sight of the Black River, the final obstacle between him and freedom. He knew that once he crossed it, he would be beyond Bacha-Bacha's reach, for now at least. With the help of his ally, Bisola waded into the Black River, the dirty, smelly but cool water washing away the dust and sweat of the journey. They crossed quickly, silently, and as they reached the other side, Bisola felt a surge of relief. He had made it. He was in the Republic of Chronicles, safe, at least for the moment. from neighbouring Kotonia to London. From Kotonia, Bisola made his way to London, where he would continue the fight against Bacha-Bacha's regime from exile. But the story of his escape quickly became the stuff of legend among those who knew him. In Alaya city, whispers circulated about how Bisola had outwitted Bacha-Bacha's secret police, escaping dressed as a woman, riding through the bushes on a motorcycle to evade capture. It was a tale that only added to his mystique, cementing his reputation as a man who could not be caught, a leader who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. As he settled into his new life in exile, Bisola knew that the battle for Muguland was far from over. But he also knew that he had survived one of the most dangerous moments of his life, and that survival had only strengthened his resolve. Bisola Eleniyan had escaped the clutches of General Bacha-Bacha, but he was not content to simply survive. He would return stronger and more determined than ever to reclaim his homeland and continue the fight for the democracy he so deeply believed in. And when that day came, the people of Muguland would remember the man who had outwitted a dictator, who had crossed borders and evaded capture, all for the sake of his freedom, and running away to live to fight another day. Bisola's escape from Muguland was a narrow one. Disguised and travelling under a false identity, he made his way to Europe, eventually settling in London, a city that had become a hub for exiled Mugulanders. But even in exile, Bisola was not content to sit on the sidelines. He knew that the fight for democracy in Muguland was far from over, and he was determined to play a central role in it. In London, Bisola connected with other exiled Mugulander politicians, activists, and intellectuals who had also fled General Bacha-Bacha's regime. They formed a coalition known as Nakamud, the National Coalition of Mugulanders for Democracy, a group dedicated to restoring democracy in Muguland and ending the military's stranglehold on power. Bisola quickly became one of the group's most influential members, using his wealth, connections, and strategic mind to fund and organize their activities. Bisola's involvement with Nakamud was not just symbolic, it was deeply practical. He poured significant resources into the organization, financing everything from propaganda campaigns to legal defenses for imprisoned activists back home. His generosity, already legendary in Alaya city, extended to the diaspora, where he ensured that no Nakamud member went without the support they needed. One of the most daring acts of Bisola's involvement with Nakamud came when he orchestrated a covert operation to smuggle vital documents out of Muguland. These documents, which contained evidence of the regime's atrocities and human rights abuses, were critical in gaining international support for the democratic movement. Bisola's connections in the intelligence community proved invaluable, as he coordinated with sympathetic diplomats and journalists to ensure that the information reached the right hands. Despite being thousands of miles away from Muguland, Bisola's influence grew. His home in London became a gathering place for exiled politicians, diplomats and activists. It was in these secretive meetings that many of the strategies for opposing General Bacha-Bacha's regime were developed. Bisola's name became synonymous with the fight for democracy, and he earned the respect and admiration of those who fought alongside him. But Bisola's involvement with Nakamud was not without risks. Bacha-Bacha's reach extended far beyond Muguland's borders, and his agents were known to operate in foreign lands, tracking down and silencing dissenters. Bisola had to be constantly on guard, changing his routines, moving between safe houses, and ensuring that his communications were secure. One particularly harrowing incident occurred when Bisola narrowly escaped an assassination attempt by Bacha-Bacha's operatives. He had been scheduled to attend a high-profile event in Paris where he was to meet with other Nakamud leaders and European politicians. Hours before the meeting, Bisola received a tip-off from a trusted contact that an assassination squad had been dispatched to take him out. He cancelled his appearance at the last minute, avoiding what would have been a deadly ambush. The incident only strengthened Bisola's resolve. He knew that the fight against General Bacha-Bacha would be long and dangerous, but he was committed to seeing it through. The attempt on his life became a rallying cry for Nakamud, further galvanizing the movement and attracting more support from the international community. As the years passed, Bisola continued to play a crucial role in Nakamud's efforts. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the world did not forget the plight of the people of Muguland. Through his efforts, the regime's human rights abuses were brought to the attention of global leaders, and the pressure on Bacha-Bacha's government grew. Ultimately, Bisola Eleniyan's time in exile was a period of immense challenge and growth. He transformed from a local power player in the ghettos of Eleniyan city into an international figure, respected and admired by those who fought for democracy and justice. His generosity, strategic brilliance, and unyielding commitment to the cause made him a key player in the struggle against Bacha-Bacha's tyranny. But Bisola's story was far from over. The fight for democracy in Muguland was ongoing, and Bisola knew that one day he would return home. The lessons he learned in exile, the alliances he forged, and the battles he fought would all serve him well when that day finally came. As Bisola looked toward the future, he knew that his time in London was but a chapter in a much larger story. A story that would one day see him return to Muguland not just as an exile, but as a leader, ready to rebuild his nation and claim the power that had always been his destiny.
The reign of General Bacha-Bacha was one of the darkest chapters in the history of Muguland. His brutal crackdown on democracy activists was relentless, and the fear he instilled in the populace was palpable. The sight of his men was enough to make grown men pee in their pants as rumors circulated that everyone's phone had been bugged, and that the maximum ruler could literally listen to any conversation as it happened. Consequently, previously brave and outspoken men became mouses, who were even too afraid to complain about the dictator in the relative safety of their own homes. Such was the terror that General Bacha-Bacha inspired. But even as he unleashed his reign of terror, there were those who refused to be silenced. Among them were the democracy agitators, a group of determined individuals who fought back against the military regime with everything they had. At the center of this resistance was Bisola Eleniyan, who despite being in exile played a crucial role in funding, organizing, and strategizing the operations that would shake Bacha-Bacha's hold on power. The killing of Alhaja Fausatu Abisowo, the wife of OMK Abisowo, was one of the most chilling and symbolic acts of Bacha-Bacha's brutality. Alhaja Fausatu was a prominent figure in the democracy movement, known for her outspoken criticism of the military regime. Her assassination sent shockwaves through Muguland, demonstrating the lengths to which Bacha-Bacha would go to maintain his grip on power. On a hot afternoon in Mushin, Eleniyan city, Alhaja Fausatu was traveling in her car, surrounded by her usual entourage of loyal supporters. She had just left a meeting with fellow democracy activists, where they had discussed strategies to keep the pressure on Bacha-Bacha's regime. But as her convoy made its way through the bustling streets, an unmarked van pulled up alongside her car. The windows of the van rolled down, revealing masked men armed with AK-47s. Without warning, the assassins opened fire. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets as bullets tore through the car, shattering windows and puncturing the metal. Alhaja Fausatu's car swerved violently, but there was no escape. The hail of bullets continued until the car came to a stop, riddled with holes. The assassins, having completed their mission, sped away, leaving chaos in their wake. When the dust settled, Alhaja Fausatu Abisowo was found slumped in her seat, lifeless. Her assassination was a clear message from General Bacha-Bacha and his murderous squad. Anyone who dared to oppose him would meet the same fate. As news of Alhaja Fausatu's death reached London, Bisola Eleniyan was devastated, but his resolve only hardened. He knew that the struggle for democracy was now a matter of life and death. In a sober meeting with other Nakamud leaders, Bisola spoke with a quiet, steely determination. Alhaja Fausatu's blood will not be in vain. Bacha-Bacha thinks he can silence us with bullets, but he's wrong. We will fight back, and we will do it with the strength of 1,000 voices. We will make him pay for every life he takes. Bisola's words galvanized the movement, and he immediately set about organizing a series of protests and international campaigns to draw attention to the regime's atrocities. He ensured that funds were made available to support the families of those killed or imprisoned, and he intensified efforts to smuggle critical information out of Muguland, exposing the regime's brutality to the world. One of the most daring and legendary figures in the democracy movement was Chief Isaac Adesanmi, a senior advocate of Muguland, San, and a man revered for his courage and indomitable spirit. As a prominent, fearless, and very outspoken leader of Nakomu, General Bacha-Bacha considered him a significant threat and ordered his assassination. But what was meant to be a swift execution turned into an event that would become the stuff of legend. Chief Adesanmi was driving through the streets of Alaye City on his way from court when his convoy was ambushed by heavily armed men. The assailants, believing they had cornered their target, unleashed a barrage of gunfire on Chief Adesanmi's car. Over 500 rounds were fired by the team of cold-blooded assassins, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the sounds of shattering glass and twisting metal. But when the shooting stopped, something miraculous happened. Adesanmi emerged from his car, unscathed. Not a single bullet had touched him, despite the car being riddled with holes. The attackers, stunned by what they had witnessed, looked at each other in fear, saw Chief Adesanmi confidently approaching them with nothing but a white handkerchief in his hand, and without exchanging any words with each other, dropped their weapons on the ground and fled away on foot, totally forgetting about the cars they had brought for the assassination operation. Word of his survival, despite his car being riddled with over 500 rounds of ammunition, spread like wildfire. People whispered that he was protected by a special necklace he always wore on his neck, even when going to court, and that the necklace gave him the power to absorb gunfire without injury. Some of those who claimed they knew him very well claimed he belonged to a powerful but secretive white garment church somewhere in Ebute Elero, where every member, including the children, is allegedly a renowned spiritual force. Some other people, including those who were not even in the country at the time of the assassination attempt, swore that when Chief Adesanmi came out of the car on that day, he had the head of a snake in his hands and blue smoke coming out of his ears as he chanted incantations. Whatever the truth of the matter was, the legend of Chief Isaac Adesanmi only grew with each retelling, as even more outlandish details added to the episode, and so did the fear of Chief Adesanmi among General Bacha-Bacha's forces. Meanwhile, in London, Bisola received the news with a mixture of relief and awe. He knew that Adesanmi's survival would be a powerful symbol for the democracy movement. Bacha-Bacha's bullets cannot kill the spirit of Muguland. You are proof of that. We will use this to show the world that our cause is just and that nothing Bacha-Bacha does can stop us. Bisola ensured that the story of Adesanmi's miraculous escape was spread far and wide, becoming a rallying cry for the democracy movement. He also funneled additional resources into ensuring Adesanmi's safety and supporting his continued activism. As Bacha-Bacha's regime continued its crackdown, the democracy agitators decided it was time to strike back, literally. Under Bisola's direction from exile and with fearless foot soldiers on the ground in several cities of Muguland, a bold plan was conceived to target military installations in Alaye City, a move that would demonstrate the movement's ability to hit back against the regime. The plan was simple but deadly. Plant explosives near key military cantonments and detonate them simultaneously, sending a message that the resistance was not only alive, but capable of striking at the heart of General Bacha-Bacha's power. Bisola, working from London, ensured that the necessary funds were provided to acquire the explosives and pay the operatives who would carry out the mission. He was also instrumental in coordinating the timing of the attacks, ensuring that they would be carried out with maximum impact. On the appointed day, as dusk settled over Alaye City, a series of explosions rocked the city. The blasts targeted military barracks and checkpoints, causing chaos and panic among General Bacha-Bacha's forces. The regime, caught off guard by the audacity of the attack, scrambled to respond, but the damage had already been done. As news of the bombings spread, Bacha-Bacha's regime tightened its grip even further, intensifying its crackdown on suspected agitators. But the bombings had the desired effect. They showed the world that the resistance was not afraid to take the fight to the military, and they emboldened the democracy movement to continue their struggle. In London, Bisola monitored the aftermath of the bombings with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. He knew that the attacks would provoke a fierce response from General Bacha-Bacha, but he also knew that they had struck a critical blow against the regime's sense of invincibility. "We've shown them that we can fight back," Bisola said in a clandestine meeting with other Nakamud leaders, "but we must be careful. Bacha-Bacha will not take this lightly. We must be prepared for what comes next." The battle between General Bacha-Bacha and the democracy agitators was fierce, marked by brutal crackdowns and daring acts of resistance. From the assassination of Alhaji Fossatu Abisowo to the miraculous survival of Attorney Chief Isaac Adesanya and the bombings of military cantonments, the struggle was one of life and death, of tyranny versus freedom. Through it all, Bisola Eleniyan remained a key figure in the resistance, orchestrating operations, providing financial and material support, and inspiring those who fought on the front lines. His exile in London did not diminish his influence. If anything, it strengthened it, allowing him to coordinate the fight from a distance while ensuring that the democracy movement remained strong and resilient. As the battle raged on, Bisola knew that the road to democracy would be long and filled with challenges. But Bisola also knew that the sacrifices being made were not in vain. The fight for Muguland's future was underway, and with every act of resistance, the cracks in Bacha-Bacha's regime grew wider.
In the oil-rich region of Inogaland, a voice of resistance had been growing louder, echoing through the creeks and villages where the people lived under the shadow of the black gold. That voice belonged to Kelechi Osoroa, a poet, activist and leader of the Inogo people of the eastern part of Muguland, who had been speaking out against the environmental devastation and exploitation wrought by the oil companies in collusion with the Muguland government. His words were sharp, his resolve unbreakable, and his message was clear. The people of Inogaland would no longer be silenced. Kelechi was not just any activist. He was a man of immense intellect and a powerful orator. His words resonated not only with his people but also with the broader Mugulander public. He documented the destruction of his homeland, the polluted rivers, the poisoned air and the dying farmlands, all sacrificed on the altar of oil extraction. He led the movement for the survival of the Inogaland people, Mosuri NP, a group that called for justice, environmental remediation, and a fair share of the oil revenues that had been flowing out of their land for decades. The government, under the iron-fisted rule of General Bacha-Bacha, was quick to brand Kelechi a threat. But Kelechi, ever fearless, continued to organize peaceful protests, marches, and sit-ins. He used his pen as a sword, writing essays, letters, and speeches that laid bare the corruption and complicity of the oil companies and the government. His voice became a beacon of hope for the oppressed and a thorn in the side of the powerful. One fateful morning, the calm of Inogaland was shattered by the sounds of military trucks rolling into Kelechi's village. Soldiers swarmed his home, dragging him out in front of his family and then picking up 8 other perceived leaders of the unrest in Inogaland. His wife wept and his children cried out as their father was taken away, accused of inciting violence and murder. The charges against him and the others were fabricated, a cruel invention of the state to silence him once and for all. Kelechi and his alleged co-troublemakers were brought before a military tribunal, a kangaroo court with judges hand-picked by General Bacha-Bacha. The trial was a farce from the start. Witnesses were bribed, evidence was concocted, and the defense was given no chance to present its case. Throughout the trial, Kelechi maintained his dignity, refusing to be broken. He knew the verdict had been decided long before the trial began. His final words to the court were delivered with a calm and steely resolve. "I'm not afraid of the scaffold, but I'm afraid of the judgment that history will pass on those who perpetuate injustice. The Inogo struggle is just, and no lie can suppress the truth forever." On a cold morning, Kelechi and 8 of his comrades were led out of their cells. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and fear as the men were marched to a public square in the heart of Port Arcadia, the capital of Inogaland. The square was surrounded by soldiers, and a small, terrified crowd had been forced to witness what was about to unfold. The executioner, a burly man with a grim expression, prepared the nooses as the condemned men were lined up on a makeshift scaffold. Kelechi stood at the front, his eyes clear, his face calm. He knew that his death would not be the end, but rather the beginning of something much greater. He had already become a symbol of resistance, and his death would only cement his legacy. As the noose was placed around his neck, Kelechi closed his eyes and whispered a prayer for his people, for his land, and for the future. The signal was given, and the trapdoor beneath him opened. The crowd gasped as the 9 bodies dropped, hanging lifelessly from the ropes. It was over for the 8 others in moments, but inexplicably Kelechi Osoroa's rope cut after about 5 minutes on the scaffold, and he fell to the ground, still breathing and mouthing incantations. The soldiers, though afraid by this time, were ordered by their commander to string him up on the scaffold one more time. Again, Osoroa would not die. He struggled on the ropes until it broke, and he fell to the earth one more time. At this point, most of the Inogaland people present started singing an ancient dirge in unison, their soul-wrenching wails coming out in scary tunes that momentarily paralyzed the executioners on assignment from the maximum ruler. Finally, the commanding officer in charge of the operation, Captain Ika, had had enough of the weird spectacle, and he directed the 20 soldiers present to tie Osoroa down, and they rained rounds and rounds of bullets into his body and his head at very close range until his head was a mass of blood. Finally, the great Osoroa, the pride of Inogaland, lay dead under the hail of the unforgiving bullets fired at close range into his skull by 20 soldiers wielding AK-47 guns. And so Kelechi Osoroa was martyred for daring to confront the beast of Buja Citadel, as General Bacha-Bacha came to be known. But the horrors of that day were not yet complete. As the body of Kelechi laid lifeless on the ground and the bodies of his comrades hung lifeless from the scaffold, General Bacha-Bacha, who had personally watched the execution of the Inogaland 9 on live streaming into his office in Buja Citadel, ordered one final act of brutality. Soldiers were instructed to pour acid on the bodies of the executed men. The corrosive liquid hissed and steamed as it ate through flesh, ensuring that nothing but bones would remain. It was a barbaric display of power, a message to all who dared to oppose the regime. Defiance would be met with not just death, but annihilation. The crowd, already numb with fear, was horrified into silence. Even the soldiers, hardened as they were, could barely watch. The stench of burning flesh filled the air, mingling with the acrid smell of the acid. The bodies were unrecognizable by the time the soldiers were done, reduced to little more than charred remains. The news of Kelechi Osoroa's execution spread like wildfire across Muguland and the world. International outrage followed, with governments, human rights organizations, and environmental groups condemning General Bacha-Bacha's brutal regime. Sanctions were imposed, and Muguland was thrust into deeper isolation. But within Muguland, something else was happening. Kelechi's death sparked a fire of resistance that even the most brutal repression could not extinguish. Songs were written, poems were penned, and murals were painted in his honor. The people of Inogaland and beyond took to the streets in protest, their cries echoing the words of their fallen leader. "Kelechi lives!" they chanted, fists raised in defiance. "Kelechi lives!" But the regime remained unyielding, responding to the protests with more violence. Villages were razed, activists were hunted down, and the military presence in Inogaland was increased. The oil continued to flow, but it was now mixed with the blood of the Inogo people. As the world reacted in horror to the actions of the beast of Buja, Kelechi's family went into deep mourning. His wife, Adana, sits in their home, surrounded by mourners. She clutches a letter Kelechi had written to her, a final farewell filled with love and hope. Tears stream down her face as she reads his words. "Do not weep for me, Adana. I go to join our ancestors, but my spirit will remain with you and our children. Teach them to love our land, to protect it, and to never stop fighting for what is right." Outside, the sun sets over the polluted rivers of Inogaland, casting a red glow over the land that Kelechi had given his life to protect. The struggle continues, but the loss is profound, and the people are left to carry on the fight without their beloved leader. Everywhere in Inogaland, and indeed all through Muguland itself, there was a sense of profound loss, and a question that hung in the air. How many more must die before justice is served? Who would save Muguland from the bloodthirsty general who would stop at nothing to suppress dissent to his rule? Little did they know that the gods of Muguland have not finished their sport with Muguland. The next thing that happened left everyone speechless. It was a night like any other in the opulent chambers of General Bacha-Bacha, but the air was thick with tension, anticipation, and something far more sinister. The general had developed a taste for the decadent, and this night he had summoned 3 beautiful women flown in from Lebanon to entertain him in the privacy of his heavily guarded mansion inside Buja Citadel. These women were no strangers to the general's demands. They had been selected for their beauty, their skill, and their willingness to participate in whatever dark fantasies the tyrant had conjured. The room was dimly lit, the air filled with the scent of incense and the sound of soft music. The general reclined on a luxurious bed, his uniform discarded, replaced by a loose robe. The women danced before him, their movements slow and sensual, the light reflecting off their oiled skin. They fed him delicacies, fruits, and a particular dish he loved, a spiced delicacy imported from the Middle East and served on exotically prepared apples. The general was especially fond of this delicately prepared apple pie from Lebanon because it gives him an almost superhuman libido, followed by a series of organisms that often lasted through the night while ensconced in the embrace of several foreign women of easy virtues. But what the general didn't know was that this Lebanese apple had been laced with a potent poison, a substance so deadly it would bring even a man of Bacha-Bacha's notorious strength to his knees. The poison worked quickly, insidiously, slipping into his bloodstream as he watched the women perform unspeakable acts before him. His enjoyment turned to confusion, then to panic, as he felt a burning sensation in his chest, a tightening in his throat. The women continued their dance, pretending to be oblivious to the growing horror in the general's eyes. Bacha-Bacha tried to rise, but his legs failed him. He clutched his chest, gasping for breath, his vision blurring. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the smiling face of one of the women, her eyes gleaming with a cold, calculating satisfaction. General Bacha-Bacha, the man who had ruled Muguland with an iron fist, was dead. His reign of terror, which had claimed so many lives and crushed so many dreams, had come to an abrupt, ignominious end in the very chamber where he had indulged his darkest desires. Immediately, General Bacha-Bacha stopped breathing. The women jointly carried him into his bathroom and left him in his golden bathtub. They quietly dressed up and came out of his chambers, then told his aides to drive us to the airport as they have always done immediately after an all-night orgy with the beast of Buja Citadel. Without the aides suspecting anything, they were handed bales of dollars, as the general has done in the past, escorted to the same private jet that brought them from Lebanon and were flown back to their country. Immediately they landed, and even before the news of the death of the military ruler was discovered, they had promptly disappeared into the wind. Though the chief security officer of the general, vicious enforcer for the general during his reign of terror, mounted a worldwide hunt for the women with his own resources in the weeks following his death, none of the women have been seen or heard from to this day. The morning after Bacha-Bacha's death, the people of Muguland awoke to the shocking news. While they slept, the gods finished their sport with the maximum ruler. The announcement was made on the state-run radio, the voice of the announcer trembling as he delivered the news that the country's feared leader had died suddenly in the night. The details were sparse, the cause of death attributed to a sudden heart failure, but rumors spread like wildfire. At a roadside newspaper stand in the bustling heart of LA City, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the sensational headlines. Men and women, old and young, pushed and jostled to get a glimpse of the newspapers that had just arrived, each one trying to make sense of what they were hearing. "Can you believe it?" Bashiru exclaimed, his voice tinged with disbelief. "General Bacha-Bacha is dead?" Just like that, no way. It must be a trick to find out those who would be happy he's dead. He quickly left the scene in case Bacha-Bacha's soldiers swooped on the scene to catch them reading the news of their boss's death. "Heart failure, they say," another muttered, shaking his head, "but I don't believe it. That man was too strong to just die like that. Something's not right." An older woman, popularly called Mama Aladura, clutching a bundle of vegetables to her chest, leaned in closer, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. "Maybe it's true," she whispered. "Maybe God finally heard our prayers and struck him down." "But what happens now?" a younger man asked, his voice trembling. "What about the election? What about Chief Abisowo? Will they finally let him go?" The vendor, an old man who had seen his share of leaders rise and fall, shook his head slowly. My friends, this is Muguland. Nothing is ever as it seems. The gods are just beginning their game. The crowd fell silent, each person lost in their own thoughts, their minds racing with the possibilities that Bacha-Bacha's death could bring. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope, a hope that the dark days of tyranny might finally be over. In London, where the Nakamud fighters had been waging their battle for democracy from exile, the news of Bacha-Bacha's death was met with a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. For years, Bisola Eleniyan and his comrades had fought tirelessly to bring an end to the military regime, and now it seemed their greatest enemy was gone. Bisola gathered his closest allies for an emergency meeting in his London safe house. The mood was tense, the air thick with the weight of what had just occurred. "This could be the turning point we've been waiting for," Bisola said. His voice steady but tinged with urgency. "With Bacha-Bacha gone, there's a chance we can finally secure Chief Abisowo's release and restore democracy." One of the leaders, a seasoned activist named Tunde Alagidi, nodded but frowned. "But who takes over now? And will they be any better? We can't let our guard down." Another ally, Adebayo, urged. "We need to move quickly. We need to put pressure on the new leadership, whoever it is, to release Chief Abisowo and start the transition to democracy." Bisola Eleniyan nodded. "I'll reach out to our contacts in Muguland. We'll offer whatever support is needed to push this through. The people are ready for change, and we can't let this opportunity slip away." But even as they planned, a sense of foreboding hung over the room. They all knew Muguland too well. The death of one tyrant did not guarantee the birth of freedom. The forces of power in the country were vast, complex, and often ruthless. The road to democracy would still be fraught with danger. As the news of Bacha-Bacha's death spread, the people of Muguland began to hope. They hoped that the dark days of repression and fear were finally over. They hoped that Chief Abisowo, the rightful winner of the annulled election, would soon be freed from prison and take his place as the leader of the nation. They hoped that democracy would return, and with it a brighter future for their children. But the gods of Muguland, it seemed, were not done with their cruel game of fate. For even as the people dared to dream of freedom, forces were moving in the shadows, forces that would once again test their resolve, their faith, and their endurance. The death of General Bacha-Bacha was but the opening act in a new chapter of Muguland's turbulent history. The path ahead was still uncertain, and the struggle for the soul of the nation was far from over.
Born in the land of riches, gold, oil, diamond bright. But our streets are stained with blood, but the youth fight for their rights. Protesting for a future, yet they're slaughtered in the night. While the leaders sit in silence, flying private jets in flight. They drive their bulletproof cars while we walk these streets. Say there's no money, but their jets fly with ease. Our children starve, but they're too blind to see. Muguland, why can't we be free?